In my last video, I talked about how when you look at a lot of the works by one specific artist, you get a really good idea of their trademarks. And with Stephen Sondheim, when you look at a lot of his musicals, you get the idea that a lot of his female characters fall into two set categories. I mentioned that I really disagreed with the idea of gender swapping company, and to me that's because Stephen Sondheim writes women in a way that's really interesting and nuanced, and I think that gender swapping any of his shows is really reductive. I want to say that at no point will I be talking about any of the actual women in his life. I didn't know him, but I do know a lot about his shows. And when you look at the way these women are written, you can get a really good idea of what exactly these characters mean and what he's trying to say. Another really interesting thing about Stephen Sondheim is that he loves to play with time in his shows. Most of them are not in chronological order, and even the ones that are will have flashbacks or flash forwards. So the best way to get a look at how the characters developed is to look at the character that goes in reverse. Today we're talking about the origin of a musical, a movie, and a documentary that all made me cry hysterically. Let's talk Merrily We Roll Along. Unfortunately, the most famous thing about Merrily We Roll Along is the really bad reception when it opened. A lot of that is due to the really strange convention they used when casting. The show begins in 1980, but every scene goes further back in time, and our characters get younger, meaning that it ends at the beginning of our character's journey. And all of the cast members were very young, with the youngest being 16 years old. This is to show how little the characters actually understand their changes, and how the main character, Franklin Shepard, hasn't really changed since he was that young. I think this is actually a really cool convention, and it works really well, but it made it really hard for audience to resonate with the older, more grizzled forms of these characters. Merrily did have a resurgence with the reunion concert in 2002, and more recently the movie adaptation. I saw it in theaters, guys, it was absolutely amazing, I would highly recommend it. That said, I think it's best for my purposes to start as early as I can, so this summary is based on a recording of the original production. How did I get a recording of the original production?
Well, I acquired it legally, you can be sure of that.
I will also say that I'm sorry if my voice sounds weird. My girlfriend got the flu, and then in a truly shocking coincidence, I also got the flu. I'm mostly better now, but yeah. Let's get into it. The Roll Along opens with a high school graduation where our main character, Franklin Shepard, is serving as guest speaker. The student announcing says that 25 years ago in 1955, Franklin was class valedictorian, and along with his classmate Charlie Kringus, he's become a famous musical writer and film producer. Franklin comes up and gives a speech about the importance of dreaming big and holding on to your dream, but to be prepared for disappointment, because life comes for everyone eventually. He sort of rambles on for a bit, and the students in the crowd pretty much write off what he's saying, since obviously dreaming is important and they'll never get smacked down by life. One by one, the students rise from their seats and turn into a chorus asking Franklin how he got to where he is. With that, we cut to a party at Franklin's house full of rich socialites and powerful people who rave about Franklin and what an incredible man he is. At the head of it all is Frank himself, who declares that he's rich, famous, well-liked, and therefore he must be happy. He goes to greet the only person at the party not singing his praises, his old friend Mary, who's at the bar drinking heavily. He tells her that he's proud of the movie he just produced and that he knows it's good because everyone came to the party, but he refuses to ask what she thinks. She continues drinking and he goes to rejoin the party, but he's accosted by a young woman who claims he's avoiding her. She chastises him for not being more considerate of her feelings, but he tells her to be more considerate of the fact that he has a wife. A woman says that he looks young, and he says he needed to hear that, as he just got a letter inviting him to speak at his high school, and it reminded him that he graduated 25 years ago. She asks if he plans on going, and he says he will, only if his life and marriage fall apart and he needs to stroke his ego. All of this is watched by Mary, who rolls her eyes at the crowd full of phonies, and Frank for being their leader. The young woman Meg seeks out validation from Frank since this is her first movie and her career is riding on it. Mary walks by, and someone makes a comment about how she's a movie reviewer, but she hasn't reviewed their movie yet. Mary calls Meg a cute girl, and Meg says she's tempted to ask Mary what she thought. Mary snidely says she's tempted to tell her. Frank tries to put a stop to the whole thing, but Meg jumps up and asks Mary for a full review. Mary responds that she thinks the movie studio should be burned to the ground and the cute girl leading the movie should be put to death for her performance. The party continues, and finally Frank's wife Gussie makes an appearance. Gussie makes a big show of welcoming the guests, but there's visible tension between her and Frank. She apologizes for being late, and someone in the crowd mentions that she was at the opening of a play written by Charlie Kringus. Everyone in the party falls silent except for Mary, who pops out to make fun of the person for mentioning Charlie when everyone knows that he's not allowed to be brought up around Frank. She asks the crowd how many of them remember his and Frank's famous talk show interview, and Gussie yells at her to leave. Mary responds by collapsing, but this doesn't stop Gussie, and she orders that someone drags her out, proclaiming that she's no longer welcome in their house. She then turns her attention to Meg and yells at Frank for thinking he can get away with such a blatant affair. She says it's one thing to fool around outside, but to do it so brazenly in her own house is completely unforgivable. Frank tries to defend Meg, telling Gussie that she should let her have her big night without drama, and Gussie obviously flips out. One of the patrons drags Mary past, and she announces that now all of these fakes are the only friends that Frank has, and no one deserves them more than he does. She storms out, and with that, we transition back a few years. We get to see Charlie Kringus himself entering a diner looking for Mary. She asks him how it is writing alone and tries to get him to admit that he hates it, but he tells her that it's actually been great. She continues encouraging Charlie to fix his relationship with Frank and get their trio back together, but he refuses again. He tries to change the subject, but right as he does, who should walk in but Frank and Gussie, who are meeting an interviewer at the same place. Frank and Charlie both try to leave, but Mary and Gussie hold them back. Frank accuses Charlie of always riding his coattails and resenting his success, while Charlie tells Mary that Frank has completely lost his way and sold out. Gussie tries to change the subject, but the interviewer mentions that this is the first time they're seeing each other since that television interview. Gussie tells the interviewer that she bought Frank the rights to a project as a wedding present, and he's about to be a movie producer. Meanwhile, Charlie connects the dots and realizes that Mary set this up on purpose. She confesses that she did, and she's only trying to help Frank. She says he's almost too far gone, and Charlie is the only one who can save him. Mary breaks down and tells Charlie that she wants things to go back to the way they were. She says that they've lost sight of themselves and they've let life harden them too much. All she wants is for them to be happy the way they used to be, and Charlie is the only one who can make that happen. He has to talk to Frank for his sake. Charlie asks her how she can possibly still be in love with Frank after all he's done, and she concedes that he has to do it for her. Charlie agrees and goes to talk to Frank. He jokingly asks him for an autograph, but Frank flat out refuses to look at him. Instead, he turns to the interviewer and goes on a rant about a tribe in Africa where if anyone betrays another person, they never look at each other again. To them, he says, that person is dead. With that, he grabs Gussie and drags her out of the booth. Charlie tries to stop them, but Frank pushes him off and yells at him to get off him. Frank and Gussie storm out, leaving Charlie and Mary behind. We transition back to 1973 to the set of Frank and Charlie's TV interview. They're on a talk show, and while Frank is hamming it up for the camera, Charlie is sitting mostly silent. The host makes a comment about how Charlie always refuses to be on television and asks him some stupid questions before asking him why it's been so long since they had a show together. He asks how they work together, and it makes something snap inside Charlie. He explains that typically their process involves Charlie writing diligently while Frank jumps around taking phone calls and occasionally stringing a few notes together. Frank generally spends the entire time working out contracts, and Charlie barely has any idea what he does anymore since everything is motivated by money. He encourages the audience to stop Frank on the street and tell them to get back to work instead of rifling through his checkbook. He says that Frank used to be his best friend, but now he couldn't seem to care less about him or the work they do together. Back in 1968, Frank has just moved into a new apartment. Frank and Charlie get into an argument over Frank starting to give up on writing music in favor of producing, but Frank argues that he doesn't have to be poor. Mary breaks up the fight, and the trio sings about the importance of their friendship until the party is crashed by Gussie and her husband Joe. She talks about decorating the apartment, then heads into the kitchen to prepare the champagne. Mary is clearly uncomfortable around Gussie, but Frank tells her that he just needs a year and then he can completely start a new life. He goes into the kitchen, and Joe awkwardly tries to make conversation. He mentions the champagne to Mary, but she tells him she doesn't drink because she has a tendency towards addiction. He suggests that maybe she's addicted to Frank. He says that love is a complicated thing, and that everyone knows Frank and Gussie are having an affair, but that he's decided not to know, and to let them get it out of their systems for the greater good. They return and offer glasses to everyone in the room.
Here's to us.
Mary.
Come on, Charlie. Let's go have ourselves one hell of a time.
I'll be down in a minute.
We cut to the steps of a courthouse where a reporter announces that they're there to get information on the hottest divorce in decades. All the photographers gather trying to get the best angle. Joe and Gussie are the first to come out, and they're swarmed by reporters asking Gussie for answers. Joe butts in to tell them that he and Gussie are just Frank's close friends and they have no information to share. The reporter films a quick segment explaining that up-and-coming composer Franklin Shepard is being sued for damages in what is becoming a very famous divorce case. Apparently, the prosecution provided the tapes for some very personal phone calls between Frank and Gussie. Charlie and Mary manage to evade the press, but Frank's lawyer refuses to comment and tells them that Frank is going to come out the side door. Everyone rushes away, and Frank slips out. The lawyer encourages him to just settle, but Frank says that he can't give up everything, and that without his wife and children, he'll be completely alone. His wife, Beth, tries to sneak past, but Frank chases after her and demands to talk to her. Everyone tries to make him stop, but eventually Beth gives in, and everyone leaves them alone to talk. Frank tells Beth he refuses to give up on her. She asks him if he and Gussie slept together, but he dodges the question by singing to her and telling her that he can't go on without her. He tells her that he never loved Gussie, he only loved her, but she asks again if they slept together. He finally confesses that they did, and she runs away in tears. It's at this point that I want to talk about Beth and Mary. If y'all will remember, at the start of this, I said that most of Sondheim's shows have female characters that fit into two categories. The first is the perfect woman. This is a female figure who the male lead had a romantic relationship with in the distant past. She made him happy, and she could have continued to do so for his entire life, but through some fault of his own, that relationship was destroyed. The other is the cynic, a woman who sticks with the male lead through all his misdeeds and confronts him with a truth he's been avoiding. Examples of the perfect woman are Lucy in Sweeney Todd, Kathy in Company, and Sally in Follies. She's bright-eyed and optimistic, and she sees past all of the male lead's flaws right up until she doesn't. As for the cynic, we've got Mrs. Lovett, Joan in Company, and Phyllis in Follies. She's older, pessimistic, and more often than not an alcoholic. She sees the male lead for what he truly is. In this show, the perfect woman is very directly Beth, but Mary is interesting because she's sort of both. We see later on that Beth and Mary started in a very similar way. They were both young and in love with Frank. They both supported him and overlooked his flaws because they believed he was good deep down. This is the point where the two characters really diverge. Beth is the one who actually gets to be with Frank, and over the course of their relationship, she gets a way better look at the kind of person he really is. Something that it takes Mary much longer to realize. Of course, Frank's betrayal affected Beth most, but Mary also knows full well what this says about Frank's character. Beth gets out while she still can, but Mary sticks with Frank because she believes he can change, and by staying in his toxic orbit, she gets her heart broken over and over again. We don't see in this show what happens to Beth, but we know from Sondheim's other shows that the perfect woman starts a new life and is perfectly happy. Kathy moves back to Cape Cod and gets married, Cinderella in Into the Woods leaves the prince, and builds a new life with new friends. As for the perfect women who stay in the main character's orbit, they all get the same treatment as Mary. Sally gets her heart broken by Ben, and Lucy is literally killed by Sweeney Todd. Obviously, we can't blame all of Mary's problems on Frank, but we see that his actions definitely contribute. The moral of all of these stories is that while toxic people can change, they don't always, and sometimes the only thing to do is escape before they can drag you under by the sharp lapels of your checkered coat. Beth and Charlie do, and they get their happy endings. Mary and Gussie both stick with Frank, and while they're both in very bad places at the end/beginning, Mary does leave, and Gussie is implied to divorce Frank, so there's still hope on the horizon for them. The group gathers around Frank and encourages him to go on. Charlie says that he could take a break, and then they'll write a new show together, and Mary encourages him to learn from this and remember what he still has. Frank finally agrees, and Act 1 ends with the trio looking to the future and promising to keep trying. Act 2 begins at the opening of Charlie and Frank's first big show. Charlie, Frank, Joe, and Mary celebrate their success, but even more exciting than that, Beth is in the hospital giving birth to Frank's second son. Mary and Charlie leave quickly to support her, but Joe pulls Frank aside and invites him to an after-party. He tries to explain that he has to get to the hospital, but Gussie comes out and insists that Frank comes with her to the party. Frank agrees to go with Gussie, and we fade back to 1962. The gang is at a party at Joe and Gussie's apartment. Beth is excitedly looking at all the celebrities, but Frank is a bundle of nerves and he's focusing on finding Charlie. Gussie approaches them and tells Frank that he and Charlie are the reason they're throwing the party. Her husband Joe is a huge fan of theirs and wants to see more of their work. She, accidentally, spills a glass of wine onto Beth's skirt and calls Joe to take her to their closet and find her something to change into. Beth tries to say that it's fine, and Frank clearly doesn't want her to leave, but Gussie won't take no for an answer, and the two of them bustle off upstairs. Gussie pulls Frank aside, and he says he envies her ability to get what she wants and her confidence. She replies that she envies his ability to write such beautiful music. She takes him up to her greenhouse and suggests that the two of them play a game. She calls it Trading Hostages, and it involves going back and forth sharing deeply personal bits of information. She starts out strong with, "I'm very unhappy," and he responds that he's very happy. They continue going back and forth until she announces that for her birthday, Joe gave her the script to a show and is letting her produce it. On top of that, she's decided that the men to write the score will be Frank and Charlie. Frank reveals that he's actually disappointed. He was hoping that Joe would want to produce the show that he and Charlie already wrote since they worked so hard on it, but she says he has to be willing to adapt. She wants a show that's fast, loud, and funny, and Frank reluctantly agrees without asking Charlie. The two of them go back downstairs, and they're greeted by Mary and Beth. Mary tries to talk to Frank, but Gussie tells her to go find Charlie. She tells Beth that her husband is incredibly talented and that she's absolutely obsessed with him. She announces that Frank and Charlie are going to play a song from the show they're going to do for her. Charlie asks what she means, but Frank brushes him off and just starts playing. Charlie rolls with it, and together they do a number that wows the partygoers. Charlie begs Frank for information, but Gussie announces that they're going to play it again. They start up, but the audience loses interest pretty quickly, and their chattering eventually completely drowns out the music. 2 years prior, in 1962, Frank, Charlie, and Beth are in a small theater doing a number about the Kennedys. The trio takes their bows, and Frank tells the crowd to come back and that they have 2 shows every night except for tonight. Frank heads into the crowd to talk to a man he recognizes as Broadway producer Joe Josephson. Frank says that he can't talk long since he's actually going to marry Beth that night, but he asks Joe what he thought. He says that the work was good, but not very commercial. Frank leaves to talk to Beth's parents, who are clearly angry about the whole wedding situation. Frank has Mary take them downstairs, and he and Charlie go to talk to Joe. They discuss the possibility of writing a show for him, but Joe is mostly ignoring them. Before he leaves, he makes sure to tell Frank that he's too young to get married unless the girl is pregnant. Joe congratulates him. Beth and her parents run on stage arguing about this wedding. They say that Frank doesn't even have a real job, but Beth and Frank both say that he'll be a great composer and someday he'll be making enough to keep her very comfortable. They reluctantly give their blessing, and Frank and Beth begin their vows. As they end their duet, the lights go down on everyone except for Mary, sitting alone at a table in the back, watching on in tears. We're treated to a little montage of Frank, Charlie, and Mary's lives in 1958 and 59. We see Frank and Charlie cope with the several rejections that come with writing musicals, all the while encouraging Mary to get her book published. Eventually, they get fed up, and Frank and Charlie decide to write their own review. They put out an audition notice and end up excitedly bringing in Beth. One night, Frank and Charlie are sitting on their roof of their building watching the sky. They discuss how they couldn't sleep because they were too excited and because they had too many ideas. They talk about their ideas, and they agree that no matter what, they'll work together to make their dreams come true. After a moment, they're joined by a young woman who asks if she missed it. They tell her she's right on time and invite her to join them. She introduces herself as Mary from the apartment below theirs, and they tell her she's probably heard their music through the vents. Mary says that Frank has a gift, and he tells her she says all the right things. Charlie announces that he can see Sputnik, and the trio gather around to watch it cross the sky. With that, we cut back to the gymnasium and Frank's speech. The younger version of himself walks on in his cap and gown, the two grab hands and look to the future. And that's the end of it. I will say that while Frank is a very toxic character, you do get a really good idea of how he became that way. I want to end this by asking the question, is it too late for Frank? A lot of the more modern adaptations will cut the graduation scenes, but I think that that's actually the purpose of them. In the party scene, we see that a woman asks Frank if he will go to the graduations. He says that he will, only if his life and his marriage completely fall apart. The fact that we do see him speaking at the graduation at the end means that he has actually realized it. The biggest problem with him in the modern day is that he is in an echo chamber. But at the graduation, he is reminded of the man he used to be. And none of the graduating class actually think he's all that great. Mary and Gussie leave him behind, and there is actually finally a chance that he might move on. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go edit this, and if the previous adaptations are any clue, it will also make me cry.